that through seeing personal transformation at a personal level, a community level, and a national level. And today is all about hearing how that is worked out on a political level by Ruth. And we are absolutely delighted to have this interview the Right Honourable Ruth Davidson, who is the leader of the Scottish Conservatives and Unionist Party and the MSP for Edinburgh Central. And Fraser, thank you so much for coming to do this interview, the editor of The Spectator and columnist for The Telegraph. I'm going to hand straight over to you both, not waste any of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. So we've got an hour. I'm going to talk to Ruth for half an hour, and you guys can sit there and think how lame these journalistic questions are. And after half an hour, you can come and ask your own and show me up. So Ruth, I'd like to talk about the future of Scottish conservatism, something that was once an oxymoron.
Just before we start, can I just check, are you okay after that vicious attack from the pythons? Are you feeling okay in yourself? Can I ask how many tenements were there in Nairn growing up? Because it's quite a small town in the north of Scotland.
Yeah, not very many, but I like to think that in my heart I was always a tenement guy, and I think actually John Cleese has allowed me to recognise and accept my inner tenement self. It doesn't sound a bad thing, Tenement Scott. That sounds quite a nice thing to me, doesn't it?
Well, I think Teddy Taylor used to talk about them quite a while, Tenement Tories. But,
good way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Talking about that blue-collar tradition, that particularly in the sort of Presbyterian traits and values in Scotland of thrift, or as my now dear departed colleague David McCletch used to talk about, being the person that took their turn to clean the tenement step. You know, that kind of social responsibility as well as kind of thrift. So yeah, I think tenement Tories are okay, but did I hear right that you once sacked John Cleese? Is that where this has come from?
This is changing into a reverse interview rather quickly.
I was a journalist for a while.
I have to say, his copy is not that good, as we found out to our shock when he filed anyway, but... right. Now, when I left Scotland 20 years ago, Scottish Conservatives were pretty much hated. And then after that, it was even worse. They were like pitied more than hated. I mean, it was voting Tory. When I was there, it used to be seen as a giant evil in Scotland. And then it became a sort of harmless perversion, like sort of cross-dressing or cricket or something like that. I don't know. But things seem to be recovering.
Well, I think first of all, I would like to thank the Mid-Atlantic for adopting you, or at least your accent, 20 years ago when you left. In terms of Scotland, you're absolutely right. I mean, I stood in my first by-election in 2009, so that was my first sort of taste of sort of going around the doorsteps, because I had been a journalist for 10 years, and as well as having to be impartial, you've got to be seen to be impartial, so I hadn't been a member of any political party. And I stood in Glasgow North East, which is one of the most deprived areas of Glasgow. At that point, it had a Labour MP for about 75 years uninterrupted. It was Michael Martin, the former Speaker of the House of Commons, who, during the whole expenses scandal issue, had stepped aside and removed from post and then moved to the Lords. So I'm not quite sure how that worked, but anyway. So we hadn't, because he'd been the Speaker, we obviously hadn't seen a candidate there for many years, as precedent suggests. So I was knocking on all these doors in kind of Springburn and Barmulloch and Germiston and Milton and some tough areas. And I hadn't a clue what to expect. And I was expecting quite a lot of hostility, and most of the stuff I got was, "You're from who?" "Oh, hen." "Oh, hen." So there was that kind of, and you're right, it wasn't hostility. It was kind of a sympathy, and I think the Prime Minister's former pollster that still works with Populous, Andrew Cooper, has talked about one of the issues in Scotland has been you had to get past the irrelevance problem before you could even get to the hostility problem. And I think...
Aspire to hostility then, that's how bad it was.
I think when I took over the leadership of the party and was elected leader in 2011, there was a sense that people didn't really know what we stood for in Scotland, and it was about carving that out. And one of the things that we did, because of the issue regarding the Constitution at that time, we made sure that we emphasised that we were a Conservative and Unionist party. I'm pleased to see that Theresa May has taken that baton and run with it. Talking as well about some of the issues that we do different things, like taking it actually down to value level before we started building it back up in policy level. So talking about things like the idea of personal choice, personal freedom, but the other part of that nobody talks about being personal responsibility. About the idea that while it is true to also say that the state can get in the way and cause a lot of the problems that we have seen, particularly regarding social immobility in Scotland, the state still has a role to play, and it's how can we use that in a positive manner. So we did have to kind of take it back almost to first principles before we could build it back up again.
And what was there a problem with Scottish Conservatives seeing basically as being English rather than Scottish?
I think there was an element of that. I think also as well there was an uncomfortableness with the devolution settlement. As the only sort of mainstream party that had campaigned against a Scottish Parliament, it was seen as being more hostile to it and not fully engaged with it. And I think also before my leadership, you'll have anyone that's either a Scot in the room or is a close Scotland watcher will have seen from last week's Labour Party conference there was huge tussles between the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Kezia Dugdale, and Jeremy Corbyn about seats on the NEC and being able to run her own candidates at general elections and all the rest of it. But we've had that for years. That all got pushed through, in 2011 in terms of, I'm in charge of. We basically, instead of being the leader of the Conservatives in the Scottish Parliament, or Conservative MSPs, I'm the first kind of leader of all of Conservatism in Scotland. So, these are my manifestos that we stand on, it's my candidates that we're running, it's me that has to go out and rattle the can to raise the funds to be able to fight campaigns, and all of that sort of stuff is and sometimes having to take a different view from our colleagues outside because what they're suggesting is not appropriate, or we've thought of something different or better for Scotland, and having the intellectual self-confidence to articulate that and to explain that actually that's what devolution is about, and you've got to be fully involved in it.
Can you say a bit more about the differences between Scottish conservatism and English conservatism then? Or in what ways is Scottish conservatism something more than just what Tories do in Scotland?
Well, I think, I guess the one that's made the headlines just yesterday was being asked, am I going to do anything about grammar schools? And I just quite matter-of-factly pointed out to the journalist who was asking that, well, in my 5 years of being leader, I've put forward 4 national manifestos in which grammar schools have not featured and nor will they feature in any manifesto that I ever write as party leader, because actually we're taking a different approach to education.
So what are your reservations for grammar schools then?
Well, I think first of all there's some practical issues in Scotland. If you're separating kids out at 11 years old in a place like Lockerbie, and if you're one of the children that passes the 11 plus and you go to the grammar school that's in your town, what about all of the other kids that don't pass that then have to be sent on a bus and bus 40 minutes somewhere else to go to some other school that's miles away from their community and miles away from their friends? So there's practical issues with that. I also think that there are issues, and this comes back to my own education, about what are schools for? What are we trying to encourage our children to be? I went to a school in what was euphemistically described at the time as a socially depressed area. I went to school in Buckhaven in Fife, large comprehensive, in an area with high levels of deprivation, large number of children on free school meals, at that time a large drug problem, and also a large percentage of unemployment in that area. It was an unemployment black spot. And I had a fantastic education. I had a fantastic education in a school that didn't get very good academic results, because our teachers worked so hard to make sure that whatever it was that you were good at school, you could be helped with that. So we had good sports teams to help teach teamwork. We had a debating society. I'm very gobby. These are going to be long answers. I'm prepared for them now. So I was involved in that. We had a really good music department. So, I got to go to countries I would never have got to go to. We just weren't of a means to be able to, I played the clarinet badly, but they helped do fundraising and stuff, and they sent our wind band to Sweden one year, and then to the Czech Republic in 1995, and it was just opening up as a Western country before there was a McDonald's and a strip bar on every corner. So it was really, really interesting. And these are things I would never have done. Somebody had left loads of skis at our school, so we had a teacher that would pack everyone into a minibus on a Wednesday night and take us to a youth hostel in Aviemore all through the winter. We actually crashed into a ditch once, we had to help dig it out. Minibuses are heavy, by the way. I like to think I've got a bit of muscle tone, but they're really heavy. But and taught me skiing, and and I didn't come from a wealthy background, and these are opportunities that we could never have had. And I think that I learned more from that broad ability to work with people from all sorts of backgrounds than I would have done if I'd gone to a stratified educational establishment. And I think one of the things...
You basically think that grammars are bad for social cohesion then?
Well, I think that we have a different... It's different in Scotland because we've never had the same history of grammar schools that you guys have.
There were grammars.
There's a couple, so that you've still got Paisley still exists.
But you used to have a lot more. Uddingston Grammar.
Yeah, but we can probably name all of the grammar schools in Scotland between us, and there's hundreds of schools in Scotland. So I think it's a fair point to say we haven't had that same tradition in Scotland that has happened down south, and we've always had different educational backgrounds. But one of the things that I'm trying to do in terms of nudging policy and from opposition, you've got to be able to try and take people with you. And over time, we've set up lots of policies regarding how you can empower individual schools, you can empower individual school leaders. You don't have all of the comprehensives in Scotland are all run by local authorities. I've never kind of understood how the same people that run leisure centres and take your bins out have to be the de facto supplier of education, and that there's not more autonomy within that. We've talked about some of the flexibility that you can have within schools, and we're managing to move the SNP on this agenda. So we've got a new Education Secretary who's the Deputy First Minister, who's beginning to take up some of these ideas. And we just want to keep pushing them further. And I actually think that this debate in England on grammar schools, if it moved to Scotland, would be a huge distraction from some of the advances that we're making and being able to pull a lot of people onto our ground, particularly when some of the interested parties in education have had quite a strong dislike to some of the things that we've said. So the EIS is no supporter of Teach First, for example. But we have a teacher training. We don't train enough teachers in Scotland, we don't have enough teachers in Scotland. We could get some of the brightest and best graduates from Scotland into some of our toughest schools. It works elsewhere, why not try it here? At the moment, Teach First take over 100 students from Scotland, run them through the Teach First campaign. They're not allowed to teach in Scotland, so they go down to tough schools in England. Well, I'm not being nationalistic about this, but I want to be able to have that happen here too.
And what about tuition fees? University tuition fees? Because if you look at the polling on this, they show that Scots and the English think the same thing that people do. The parties are different, but there is as much support for the concept that students should contribute towards their own tuition as there is in England. Now the Conservatives down here think that's fine. I mean, so do so did Labour pretty much. Well, did.
Well, I think the issue is now that we've had time to see this policy in action. What are the results of it? The results are that there are fewer people from poorer backgrounds going to university in Scotland than there are in the rest of the UK, so areas with tuition fees. There are fewer students from poorer backgrounds who are qualifying from university, so coming out the other side with a degree. There are fewer people, or as a percentage, actually getting there because of the way in which the model is structured. The number of places that universities can offer to students is capped. And we're beginning now to see universities actually having the wherewithal and the courage to speak out on this. So one of the medical schools up in Aberdeen has said, look, we want to train more doctors, and the SNP government will not allow us because of the policy that's in place. But the worst part of this policy is that in order to pay for it, the SNP has gutted the further education sector in Scotland. 152,000 college places have been cut since 2007 under the SNP. So anybody that's lost a job and wants to retrain, or a young mother that wants to go back after the maternity leave to upskill, has much less of a chance to do that. People that want to get vocational education qualifications have much less of a chance to do that. And I know I'm talking at length, but just let me say one more thing about this, because this is something that I've thought for a long time. I completely understand in the last Labour government why there was a big push to try and increase the number of university places, and they were talking about trying to get it up to 50%. And I'm sure that it was a policy that was devised with the best of intentions. But I think one of the consequences of that policy was by putting such an inference on higher education at the expense of valuing further education. We already told half of our children that they'd failed before they began their tertiary education career out of school. And actually one of the things that we need to do, and I want to hear this from Justine Greening, now that she's getting herself in post, and it's something that I've talked about for years and I want it to keep going, is talking about how we value skills training, how we value educational training, how we value on-the-job training in this country as much as book learning in this country. They both have their place, Other countries don't do it. Germany, for example, they don't look at it as something lesser. We have to value the people that are wanting to pursue that approach, and we also have to give them the opportunities to do that approach. And giving a middle class giveaway of free education, so-called, somebody's paying. And at the moment, it's the people that are going to colleges or who are denied a place at college who would otherwise have had one that are paying the price for that policy, and our poorer students who aren't getting into university in the same numbers.
So, so what was it when you were growing up that formed your political, if not your party political sympathies, and your overall outlook on life? And was there anything in particular that made you, looking back, you think that those are sort of experiences that made me a Conservative?
Yeah, kind of episodic. My parents are both, as we, are both kind of from that working class Tory sort of Teddy Taylor tradition. My mum left school at 15, my dad at 16, because in those days you did some work. My dad was very bright, was a kind of school ducks winner, but he was the only son of 3 children, so he was also the eldest, so there was, he would have loved to have stayed at school, he would have loved to have gone to further education. But something
like 80% of people left at 16, 17 in those days.
Yeah, so he went out at 16, and was there to contribute to the family home and all the rest of it, and just worked really hard. And my mum has always been, was a smart lady, but was never really keen on school. She used to dog it quite a lot. She never told me that till after I'd left, after I'd dutifully attended. But she did. But always imprinted on my sister and myself growing up that books were our friends. We had to try our hardest, and was always. It was the hard work effort. It was that real sense of you've got to put in the work. And I remember in my second year at school, I got my school report card back, and it was grand, blah 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 blah. And I remember getting a 1 for combined science, because you didn't split it up until the third year. But combined science I got a 1, but I got a 2 for effort, because they said, what did you get for grade, what did you get for effort? And I got such a row for that, because genuinely my mother would have been happier if I got a worse grade, but I demonstrated that I tried harder. And there is that sense of that kind of working class stock, that kind of, you've absolutely got to throw yourself into it and not let people down. And I think there's a difference, actually, between wanting to make people proud and not wanting to let people down. And as a driving force, that's something that's quite important. So my parents supported myself and my sister in anything that we wanted to be. They told us we could do whatever we wanted, and would have supported us in anything. But they wanted to make sure that we had given everything 100%. And there is that sense of also looking after your family and providing for your family. And my dad, works incredibly hard. He often works in export industry, so he wasn't home a lot, because he'd be out sort of trying to sell stuff around the world, which possibly informed quite a lot of my pro-Remain Brexit views. And trying to take goods to market and stuff like that. But so coming from that proper tradition, and also going to school in an area where a lot of people were told what they had to do by the state. There's something quite suffocating, actually, about huge state intervention, and in huge sort of work, council estates and stuff across Scotland. When there was also bus regulation, there was a sense that the state, in one form or another, told you which house you had to live in. They told you which school your kids had to attend. They told you where the buses would take you, where you could travel. There was a real kind of suffocation of the state, and that leads to narrower horizons, and it does. And I think I spent much of my working life, sort of 12, 13 years in Glasgow, and I think that there's there is a sense there when you've got 1 in 3 people that are economically inactive, where you are sometimes onto second, third, sometimes even 4th generation households where no one has had a job. There is an element to which you've got to show that aspiration, that horizon, that ability that you can go out and do anything, that freedom. But I think where we get it wrong often in the Conservative Party is we like to talk about social mobility and sort of tell the tale that if you just clear the state away and you just let people rise and fall on their own merits, and if they work hard they'll get on, then that's good enough. And it starts from a noble place. It starts from that idea of making people, or it starts from that idea of wanting people to be able to make the very best of themselves that their talents allows. But what it doesn't do, it slightly suggests that if they then don't go on to great things, that's somehow their fault. And I think we're very good in this party about talking about equality of opportunity, but what we're not very good about in this party is talking about the lack of equality of empowerment. And that's some of the things that the state can do. That's some of the things that we must do. So some of the things in very small ways to talk about how you can do that. In a Scottish context, there's a bill going through Parliament right now that's looking at increasing the amount of childcare for 3 and 4-year-olds at every level. And you know, that's great. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't look at where some of the problems in families can start and some of where the inequalities can start. So I would much rather that if there's got to be a price tag that's put on that actually we split up where that money goes. So instead of, and this will be quite unpopular I'm sure with middle class mums and dads in Scotland, but instead of spending all of the money on 3 and 4-year-olds at every income level in Scotland, let's use some of that money to start with the most deprived 1 and 2-year-olds and spread that money out. Because at the moment in Scotland, the difference between the top 20% in terms of income of young people, of children starting primary 1, and the bottom 20% is 18 months in their vocabulary. If you're in the bottom 20% in Scotland, your child will start school with, on average, a vocabulary that is 18 months behind where the top 20% is. How can you possibly look to catch that up? You are starting in the system without even having a chance. And actually, it's our job to make sure that people have chances. So I think that's something that we can do.
So would you say conservatism, your conservatism is a progressive force? Would you say even progressive conservatism?
Absolutely. And I think one of the issues that we've had in Scotland, and this comes back to your very first question about the position that the Conservatives have had in Scotland, and doing badly, being othered actually by other parties and by our opponents, and being removed from the debate, is that actually we've had quite a stultifying debate. We haven't had the sort of clash of ideas and ideologies. We've had a really soft left consensus that actually hasn't led to the sort of spark that clashes can do, that spark of ideas and ingenuity, and I think that one of the things that we can do, and one of the things that I'm keen for us to do, having now become the main party of opposition, being in the top 2, is actually have the same sort of debates in Scotland that other countries in Western democracies take for granted about different ways in which you can do things. Because in so many of these policy areas, there is no one right way. If there was, the entire world would all be doing the same thing. But there are ways in which you can have that creative clash of ideas and spark, and really find ways in which you can adapt policies to your age, to your place, and to your time.
You've spoken quite a lot about those at the bottom of society, and in Scotland, especially in Glasgow, you've got some of the most astonishing poverty in Western Europe. Would you say that remains a priority for the Scottish Conservatives? Because one of the changes Theresa May has made is to switch the focus from those at the bottom to those who are just managing. That's her phrase. Things are different, of course, up and down there. I'm wondering if your priority remains those at the bottom.
I don't think it's an either or. I don't think you switch focus. I think you grow what it is that you try and achieve. But you absolutely have to look after the people who've got the least life chances. And I mean, I don't like falling back on stats, but sometimes they can tell you much bigger truths. And if you look at, for example, there are more than 15,000 looked after children in Scotland. But in terms of our prison population, a quarter of all people in prison will have been in care at some point, despite the fact that 2% of the country will have been in care. Within, more than 10% of people who leave care will be homeless within 2 years. These are young people, these are teenagers. They will experience homelessness. So we absolutely have a moral duty, not necessarily a political one, but a moral duty. We've got to absolutely make sure that through accidents of birth that are nobody's fault, people aren't being disadvantaged to the way in which they are now. And I think we launched a book, I brought it along earlier this week at conference, and I think everything's slightly being crowded out by Brexit at this conference. I think that's a shame, because I think there's some really good work that's going on.
It's a social justice in Scotland.
Yeah, it's a discussion paper. So it talks about, we did a big cross-party consensus actually developed around working out what we do in Scotland, how we do it, and how we can do it better. And it was a report that was published by a chap called Campbell Christie 5 years ago, and this is a bit of an update on what he suggested then and what we haven't done to take up the mantle. And one of the things that his report found was that 40% of spending is on ameliorating things that we could have fixed earlier on. So it's on breakdown spending. So what he was talking about was doing things further upstream. Now, we've got to have loads of powers over welfare that come to the Scottish Parliament. So we're having to think big thoughts about how we deal with welfare and benefits that have always been the provision of the House of Commons and of Parliament down south before. But there are things that are in our powers now, and what this is the kind of David Brailsford school of policy making, in that it's lots of little things, but that all added together can actually make a very big difference. So some of the measures are quite small, and one of them, for example, talking about in-care children, looked after children, is the fact that in Scotland we don't have a mandatory minimum for how much we help support foster carers for. England does, Wales does, now there are different levels, but we don't have that, and there are some councils in Scotland that don't really help or support. Now, this isn't about paying people to look after children, but this is about making sure it doesn't cost them so much that it's beyond them to do it. It can take up to 2 years. The average adoption process in Scotland is 2 years from your first point of contact with the state to finally being able to take a child into your home and be their named parent. Now, I have within my own family, there is an adoption ceremony. My sister's really careful. I have to be really careful about how I word this because she doesn't like her kids to be talked about in a way that is identifiable for when they grow up. But within our own family, we've got a lot of experience in that, and it's something that can make a huge difference to the life chances of people. And there are folk out there that want to adopt and that give up during that process. Now, absolutely, it's got to be people that are committed. Absolutely, it's got to be people that the processes of checking and reassuring that child protection is in place is right. But there are other countries in which we can do this faster, and there are ways in which those children don't have to spend 2 years in the system before they can be in a loving home.
And do you see this as a way of branding the Conservatives in Scotland then? The Conservatives are a force for social justice. Is that the way you're pitching it? Is that the way you'd like to see the Conservatives?
No, it's about doing what's right. This isn't about branding or sloganeering. This is about things that we can do better in Scotland that we're not doing well enough. I don't know from whichever party. I mean, almost everybody in Parliament, whether that's House of Commons or the Welsh Assembly or Stormont or Holyrood, irrespective of what your party background is, most elected politicians are absolutely in it for the right reasons. It's because they want to make a difference. Now, we all disagree about what the best approach is, but don't think that we're not coming from a genuine place. And I will always make sure that I afford my opponents the benefit of the doubt that they are also coming from the best place. Now, most of the time they're just wrong. However, but people that leave jobs, that leave careers, that go and spend time, sometimes years, and believe me, trying to get elected as a Tory in Scotland, it can take years to get elected. It's because you want to make a difference. It's because you want to change things. And if people notice, that's great. But even if nobody noticed, if we could make the government change their policy on this, if we could become the government and change policy on this, then I'd be, that's what it's about. It's not about branding.
Right. Well, the Scottish Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats also want to make a difference for their own. Both of them have been completely, well, not quite destroyed, but Scottish Labour has it's about like metal fatigue. It looks solid until it just collapses. The Liberal Democrats don't seem they're going to be forgiven in Scotland for going into coalition with the Tories. Do you feel sorry for either of them?
Well, I have to say, I mean, I for those who were at conference last year, I kind of opened my speech saying that my first election that I'd ever voted in when I was 18 in my first year at university was the 1997 general election. I was in my first year at uni, and one of the student associations had been hired out, so none of us had tellies, to show the results come in and keep the bar open through the night. And my mate said, "Come on down." They didn't tell me till I got there that it had been hired by the University Labour Club. And I was the only Tory in a room of 150, 200 drunk baying lefties cheering as every single Tory seat in Scotland fell. Now that is character building, let me tell you. So you would think that from that, and particularly in the period between 1997 and now, when there really was a sense from our opponents that they wanted to other us, that we weren't, something you could talk about around the dinner table, the kind of taking babies type, accusations that were posed at us. You would think that I would be rubbing my hands with glee with what's happening to the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats in Scotland. And actually I'm not. I've even surprised myself by that, but actually I'm not, because I think if you think particularly in a Scottish context, of some of the really big beasts that have come out of Scotland, the Robin Cookes and the John Smiths and the
Gordon Browns, we could have done without him.
Well, let's. I'm sure he'll reanimate out soon and make one more speech and then go back into wherever his hibernation is. But if you think of some of those really big, even if you disagree with them and disagree with them profoundly, the idea that the party of that has been reduced to the party as it is now is actually kind of sad. But I think actually from both of them, part of it is a cost from having othered us for so long. Because part of it, not all of it, but part of it, particularly in the Liberal Democrats' case, with the Scottish election coming just a year after they formed a coalition with the Conservatives at Westminster, absolutely rightly in my opinion, because we needed a stable government of the country given the economic crisis that we were facing. I think they absolutely did what was right for the country in that case. But they were really punished for that in Scotland. But they were punished for that in Scotland because they had told the myth for 20 years that we were something that was to the other, that we weren't somebody that you could do business with, that we didn't have a voice in the debate. So I think in many ways, they're kind of reaping what they're sowing, but I take no pleasure in it. I think that Scotland will work better. I think the politics of Scotland will work better. The policy making of Scotland will work better. The social cohesion of Scotland will work better when you have strong parties trading ideas in a parliamentary manner and taking those with the strongest way that they can, with the best people that they can to the country and letting the voters decide.
Okay, well, let's open this up to the questions. So why don't you go first? There's a mic coming your way.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Ruth. I've often thought that one of the greatest threats to the Union is the fact that nowadays ordinary Scots and ordinary English people seldom interact with each other. In fact, it's probably true to say that thanks to foreign holidays, cheap foreign holidays, the ordinary person walking the streets of Birmingham below you will probably have more interaction with a Greek or a Spaniard. This is particularly acute because our armed forces are so small now, and they were traditionally...
I do holiday in Greece and Spain myself. So I've met lots of my English cousins when I'm out there, but yes.
No problem. This is particularly acute because our armed forces are so much smaller now, and they were traditionally the melting pot that threw ordinary people of the Union together. So do you think there's a case, if not necessarily for national military service, certainly some sort of national citizen service, that once again throws together ordinary teenagers from your constituency and ordinary teenagers from my constituency?
I love that. Compulsory holidays in Aviemore. What do we think of that?
Well, that's being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. No. No, I love my time at the Lochmorley Police Hostel in Aviemore. I will never hear it knocks. I think there's a lot in that question. You had lots of different strands there. If I can kind of address them one by one. I mean, first of all, I think it's just not true to suggest that there's not a huge crossover in people. And we know from during the referendum campaign when we were trying to kind of quantify all of this thing. I think it's something like is it a million, or it's close to 1 million anyway, of people who've been born in other parts of the UK that currently live or work in Scotland and vice versa. So there's a huge crossover in terms of that. In terms of your setting that up in order to talk about whether I believe in a national citizen service or a national conscription. I think as somebody who was in the reserve forces for a number of years before I stupidly threw myself out a window and broke my back in 3 places and got medicaled out because I have a cavalier attitude to personal safety. I would absolutely urge caution about conscription. I think, particularly given the grave situation that we face in the world and the nature of military engagement is changing. It's no longer nation state against nation state. I mean, when you're talking about ISIS and Daesh and others, it is very difficult warfare. I mean, that is incredibly difficult, and you need the highest caliber of professionals to be able to conduct that in an effective way that minimises casualties. you don't want people that are compelled to wear the uniform, weakening the professionalism of armed forces. So I'm utterly, utterly against conscription. Your point about the National Citizen Service, though, I think is an interesting one. I actually think that the idea that David Cameron put forward about that was good. I wish that we had it, or something similar to it in Scotland. The SNP will never agree to it because it's seen as conservative and they won't badge it. I have spoken sort of years ago when it was first being launched to people within the SNP, and there was no wish, no take up for it. But I think this idea that you take kids, whether it's across border or whether it's just from across communities and within the country, and throw them together and help support them as they do charitable work, as they learn leadership skills, as they do the sort of interactions that takes you far beyond and gives you an education that's much broader than just the education you get in your school. I think that is a noble, virtuous and good thing in and of itself, and I would love to see a formalised way of doing that in Scotland. I really would. I think I don't care what you call it. I don't care, whether it mirrors the model down south or not. But I just think that particularly that year, that 17, 18, that teenage year, and sort of the space between leaving school and either going to a job or